Okay, so I'm going to just go through a little bit more detail of what the workflow is and just try and slightly less breathlessly go through the process in Blender and all those bits and pieces, Metashape, all of that. So I've actually added a little bit to the last stage of this PDF. I've added the links kind of inline to the PDF for the tutorials to tell you how to do different things, so you don't have to rely exclusively on me going through these in this video. And I've also added a little bit of an outline. So if we go back to the tools that we're going to be using in this setup, we've got Metashape for reconstruction, MeshLab, which is a few different filters and things that we can use, and also good for converting, kind of a just general tool that will be useful. Blender for the sculpting, Blender for retopology and UV maps, or instant meshes for retopology, and then Substance Painter at the end. And I've just added this to give a bit more of an idea of what we're doing in that process. So we start with our photogrammetry, which is going to be messy. It's going to be fairly noisy, all that sort of stuff. And hopefully this gives a bit more of an indication of what we're trying to do. We want to have two things. So we want to have a cleaned up high poly version of the model. And some of this might be fake as well. So, you know, for the thing that we're about to look at, part of it is obscured. Depending on what you want to use that object for, you know, most of the time you want the object to be separated from its environment and just kind of a nice solid whole. You can kind of do stuff where you take a whole object and you put it on a turntable, for example, take pictures from all different angles, or you take a set of pictures and then lift it up and turn it around and take a bunch of other pictures and then try and sort of combine the two things together. You could as well take photogrammetry from two sides and combine them in Blender, and then sort of clean up the interface. That's an option. But in general, unless you've got a really particular use that you're thinking of, you want to have your object being sort of just a nice standalone object, not connected to like the table that it's sitting on or something like that. So this sculpted high poly, we want this to be as nice as possible. We have the opportunity to go and sort of finesse how it looks, to clean up the noisiness, and also if we need to kind of reconstruct in terms of crafting the shape and sculpting the shape, if we need to fix things. Often the bit that we won't see very often will be the bit that we replace, and it's just there to sort of give it just a bit more completeness. But we'll have a look at that in a minute. And then this other thing that we're doing is once we've got that, you know, really nice, good, clean version of the model, the sort of ideal version of it, we want to retopologize it so that we can do this process of baking the textures and then have a version of it that's low poly but that looks like the high poly version because it's got all the details that are baked onto the surface of it. I've just added another bit here to include the instant meshes. So, you know, another part of the process where rather than doing the hand retopology in Blender or Maya, you can use instant meshes. And I'm just sort of added again a little bit more information. We've gone through this process of using Metashape, gone through the process of trying to improve alignment in case there's any problems, progressively removing cameras that seem to be creating bad information, all that sort of stuff. Filling the holes, exporting, all of that. So we have that in the other video. I'll go through pretty much from the Metashape stage and then into Blender. But what might be useful here is just a discussion of when we might use instant meshes for retopology and when we might use hand retopologizing. So this is good for organic shapes where we really don't care about the structure of the geometry, but we want it to sort of fit nicely, to have good correspondence to the original. And you can see that this is pretty good at doing it. If you had to hand model this, it would be hard to get those sort of shapes. You'd be spending a long time starting from general shapes and then subdividing and subdividing. So instant meshes is good for that situation. The situation where you would want to do it by hand would be, for example, you have an object. The car that I had, there's a line of symmetry. The shapes are man-made shapes, so they're pretty, they have a structure to them that's not too hard to sort of build from low poly and then maybe subdivide and add a little bit more nuance to it. And also, if we want to use like facial animations, for example, we want to set it up in a way where we can shift certain points on this model, and there'll be a nice, clean, symmetrical, unsurprising deformation of the face. So closing the eyes, you just sort of take these vertexes and sort of move them down in a particular way. And often you've got an animation for a face that assumes a really particular geometry of the face. So you kind of have to do it yourself. This is the usual way that kind of corresponds to where different muscles in the face are. So it's got an interesting kind of, anatomical sort of element to it. Also using LEDs, levels of detail, so something where you might want to have different versions of the model at different distances. If you do it automatically, then the shape might change as you go down to much smaller poly counts. Whereas if you do it yourself, basically what you do is that sort of initial low poly version of it would be the lowest level of detail, and then as you go up, that subdivision that you do to add sort of more contours and shapes would be sort of higher and higher up until the point where it's much higher detail. And as you're doing that as well, because you're controlling how it's working, you can also have the texture kind of sitting consistently on the model. If you use this one, then at every different poly count that you try and generate, you have to recreate UV maps, which means that you can't share the UV map between different poly counts of models. Whereas if you do, say, a cube, UV map that, and then subdivide it to get more shape correspondence, then that same texture will be mapped and shared across all those different versions. So probably at the moment it's not a super important thing to know the intricacies of, but these are just the sort of use cases where that would be the case. And it might be that you just find it more convenient to do instant meshes for the moment, but it's good to know how to do the hand stuff as well. What else? Okay, so our little cheat sheet of how to do it by hand. I also added something just talking about Substance Painter, and one thing that if you're kind of new to using objects, you might, for example, download a free model or something. When we're talking about the capacity for mobile devices to render, the limit is much lower than on a desktop computer. And there's a process in representing an object where each unique material in that object, say one part of it is wood and one part of it is like metal or something like that. Each part of that object is a different material, and each material has to be represented through a different draw call. So every frame that might be 60, 90 times a second, it has to split the job of rendering it up into lots of different tasks, and each task is called a draw call. If there's more materials, there's more draw calls, and the process is slower. So what we are doing in Substance Painter in this process, the way that it works is, even though different parts of the model might be different materials, so this could be wood, this could be metal, what have you, we're just doing them all onto the same material. So the different parts are modeled onto different parts of this, and that means that it's going to be a single draw call for the model, and it's going to run faster. So there's something about the particularities of how we do this instead of just grabbing a wood material and applying it to one part of the object, and grabbing a metal material that we've sort of downloaded or found on the internet. Doing this process actually also is a much better practice for creating materials and making them behave in a nice way. Okay, so let's jump in. I'll just bring this across. I'll drag this across to my other screen so I can make reference to it if I need to. And let's just start with Metashape. So we've got our nicely aligned cameras. What we are doing, our first task at this point, is to clean this up as much as possible and to focus on creating a nice high poly version of this model that's kind of isolated. So we don't need to at this moment think about retopology. We just want to think about how to make this look as good as possible and like the original object. So I've gone through and I've done the just the sparse camera alignment. I've done a dense reconstruction. It's not heaps of detail. This is, I think, actually a high or an ultra high. Okay, it's a high but dense cloud. It's a high, but the ultra high didn't really produce that much more, just because there's not many pixels in the images to do it. So this is the best that I could get from this dense point cloud. You'll see as well, because there's not very many shots from kind of down low on the image, we don't get very much information kind of where it's been obscured by itself. So most of the shots are from, I think we can look through these. Where is it? Just look through. Okay, so we can sort of see where these shots are done. It might have been worth doing another pass just a little bit lower than these ones, so just sort of much closer to the table maybe, or another possibility is to turn it over and use that as a separate chunk that we then kind of piece together through the two exported parts. But we've got all these bits here, and what I'm going to do is make use of Mesh Lab to just remove, if I can, that kind of sort of cream colored table stuff. So I'm going to export it. Where I export points. Okay. I'll just call it points, that's fine. I've opened up Mesh Lab. I'm going to import mesh. Let's see if we can find it. There we go. Okay, and with any luck, I should be able to do a selection filter based on color. It says faces, but it will also do vertices. It doesn't really matter what it's called. And what we want to do, it's a very powerful tool, but it's also kind of basic in some ways. I wasn't sure that there was a sort of color selection for grabbing things, but there it is. So I can pick color. I'm just going to try and see if I can get something which is, a color fairly close to most of the table, but far away from the green. Also, what I could do is just select the green and try and do an inverse of that. That would be interesting. Turn on preview. And I crank it down until kind of want just that. Oop, getting there. But we also want that stuff there. Actually, we don't want that. To be honest, I'll give it one more go of the table color just to see how much we can clean up. Sometimes this works really well. Normally when you've got like a green screen or something that you've chosen as a background and there's a little bit of bleed from one to the other, that worked quite well. Okay, cool, so that was good. I've got a little thing there, but that's fine because I think I'll be able to hole patch it. I'm going to say apply, and I'm going to hit the delete vertices, and that's a little bit more cleaned up. probably what I'll do is just delete a whole bunch of this stuff with the selection tool anyway. And now I will export mesh as a PLY, and that looks correct. The right folder, points, cleaned, only a little bit clean, but that's good to show what the process is. And I'll go back into MeshLab and re-import this. Import points. Yes. Okay, so that is a little bit cleaner. I'll also go and select the freeform selection and just drag and delete a bunch of the stuff that I know is no good around here. Pretty much all of that is awful. Using the Marquee Selection sort of tool, the way that or this sort of like freeform selection actually, kind of backwards, where you're just relying on the straight edge of the closed shape, is kind of a nice controlled way of doing this, just as a tip. You might know it already, but for things where you don't want to kind of overstep and you don't want to rely on your ability to draw a freeform shape, it's kind of nice to be able to see exactly what's going to be cut. And as well, sometimes there's really obvious straight edges in your model that you know you want to cut out, so it's really good for just making sure that you do have a straight edge. That is heaps messy, that bit there, so I might just go Wishka. And yeah, all of that is pretty much the noise from the table and that stuff too. And then that little bit there, if you can see, is also not good. I think there's a hide tool, so we can sort of select a whole bunch and make it invisible so that we can then, let's see, edit. Tools. Well, I thought, what's that, delete, crop? Oh, that's the wrong way. Okay. I think I have actually just deleted that. I thought that was a visual tool. It's not, but that's okay. We can just go from there, and I'll do a reconstruction. I think that bit is also not something that we want. Okay, cool. So I will build my mesh. I'll do it high detail because, well, there's not that much detail in the dense point cloud, so I'm not going to go crazy with it. If you had amazing detail in here, then do it high detail, and then you capture that in the sculpt. I'll just do it fairly low. We'll see how this goes. All right, so yeah, as I said, in theory, what we would be doing at this point is a nice high detail reconstruction, but there's not really heaps and heaps of points of nice clean detail in this one. There's a few little bumps. How's that look? What's the geometry look like? We could have probably done it a little bit higher to capture some of that sort of bumpy detail, but this kind of shows what we're thinking at this point. So I'm just going to delete some of this extra stuff that's formed on the edges. Might change my perspective a little bit. All of this stuff that's just trying to form a nice watertight mesh, but obviously not being very successful in introducing a little bit of kind of weirdness to the process. Just a little bit of a kind of skirt coming out. And yeah, okay. Okay. So now I want to close the holes. Okay, so that's all been flattened out, and I will export this. I've already done this before, so let's call it arrow. Ooh. Okay, FBX is fine. We could have also done it as a OBJ, but it doesn't, at this point, it's not really important. I'm in Blender, I'm going to import it, and just a reminder that what we want to do here is basically clean it up and make it a nice high poly model. It's not too far from what it's, how it's positioned at the moment, because we can sort of reproject the texture if we want to. Where are we going? Reconstructions. And close talks. Right. So I want to go to sculpting. I might actually just save this with this setup at the moment. Not in there. I'll call this high poly, just in case it crashes or something, and then I can just every so often Control S to save. So I'm in sculpting. I will select the object. Let's go into Sculpting Mode. And if you remember, what I want to do first is remesh it. I'll just try this default to see what it looks like first, and that is way too big. I'm going to set this to about, how's that, 10th? Okay, that's not hugely terrible. And I'll turn on my dynamic topology, just so that when I start sculpting this, it will keep the detail that I've got. 77. Just going to make it a little, I'll make it 200. We'll see how that goes. Okay. And now I can use the square brackets to change the size of this. And as with ZBrush, if I hold down Shift, I can do a smooth. Just going to go over and kind of smooth out all the weirdness of it first. I might actually reduce the intensity of the smoothness, which I can do either up the top here, the strength, or I can do it over on the right hand side. I'll just bring it down a little bit. Make this big. I don't want to get to the point where I'm accidentally deleting some nice detail. I'm still almost doing that. Oh, actually what's going on is I'm not changing the strength of the smooth tool. I'm actually just on the default draw tool, which is this sort of pulley up thing. And holding Shift brings up the smooth tool, but if I want to change the settings for it, I will need to go down to Where is it? What does it look like? Somewhere along here. Again, I don't really use Blender that often, so I'm not really sure. Smooth, there we go. Okay, bring that down. Okay, it's a little bit easier to handle. You know, it's like the blur tool in Photoshop or whatever. If you sort of go back and use it a bunch, you can kind of get it to reapply. And here at our weird intersection, we're going to want to start to do some work to give it a more natural shape. What I think I'll do is maybe try and combine, I try and take this half and then sort of duplicate it and join it back together to see if I can get it kind of looking like a real shape. Alright. I'm just going to crank this up because I want it to be a bit more aggressive for these really ugly sections here. Okay, so as I'm smoothing this out, you see that it's creating a little bit of weird geometry where, you know, the smooth tool can only do so much. So if there's crinkles and weird kind of like holes and things within it, like that really messy stuff before, then it's just going to still be a little bit of a problem at this point. I've just realized that my Dyn topper wasn't on while I was doing that, but that is okay. So what I'm going to do now is just with my smoothed version, I don't want to remesh. I don't want to lose heaps of information when I do this remesh, so I could make my remesh a little bit bigger, but I'm just going to remesh it again so it gets rid of that sort of messiness there. And let's see how that looks. Okay. And if I had heaps of detail on that, so if my Dyno topo had been on correctly, 200, then when I was doing, let's see if it's on now actually. It's maybe a similar problem to what I was having before. Yeah, that's on. Doesn't seem to want to work on the smooth. That's all right. So say I had heaps of detail here that I'd drawn on it, and like nice, very, very small detail with, what's this, with a nice bump to it or something, then I could have retopologized with a smaller voxel size just so it kept all of this detail that I've got, so that all of that detail was still captured in it. But since at the moment I don't have very much detail, I can just retopologize it fairly low, come back and just smooth out those weird bits just to make them go away. Fix that geometry. Okay. And as I say, what we could do, I'm just going to save before I start doing something clever. Just going to go to modeling, and we kind of probably want the two halves of this thing. Object mode, we probably want the two halves of this thing, so this is a good basis for the other side of it, I reckon. So what I might try and do is duplicate it. Let's see. Don't know if Control D duplicates it, but I'm just going to cut and paste it. And now let's see if we can rotate it. Okay. and move it. If this was like nicely aligned to a particular axis, then this would be much easier to do. Let's say that seems maybe okay. It's a little bit funny. And let's see what would be good to do. I kind of want to cut off one whole section of this. Just to end at that point. So I'm going to go back into sculpting, just having a little bit of an experiment of the best way to do this. We're on that model, yes. We can turn on sort of the selection filter so that we can choose which objects we can actively select or not. Just going to turn off the other model so I don't accidentally select it. And let's just push in. Oop, that's me accidentally selecting the wrong model. Which one's which? Yeah, okay. Well, it's all still always being the wrong one. That's funny. Oh, oops. Oh, well, it was good to save it. I think what was happening was I should have selected the object when we went into sculpt mode. Oop. Yeah, all right, so it was good to save it. Let's try that again. Cut and paste. Take this one. See if we can't rotate it. To kind of contribute to this. Okay. So in sculpting mode, let's start with the second one. I'm going to turn on the selection tool again. So starting with this one, just going to save at this point. Again, go into sculpt mode, and it should be, yeah, that's right, okay. Because we had this one selected when we went into sculpt mode, it should be behaving itself. Now I can push instead of pulling by holding down Control when I'm using the draw tool. It just takes the surface and pushes it in rather than dragging it out. So I'm just going to go through and do that. This stuff here, let's see, probably want to change the radius and the strength a little bit so I can do it a little bit more controlled to kind of merge it into that. Actually, at some point we do want it to kind of fit. We will have to sort of merge it. So I'll just take it from around there. But leave a little bit at the bottom that we can then sort of smooth out or merge in. You see that when I'm using this push tool as well, it keeps some of the geometry that we've got. So it doesn't remove shapes. I think that sort of line is okay. I'm just going to get rid of some of the stuff that we definitely don't want. Like this stuff at the top is not going to be useful because we're just going to keep that one at the bottom. That stuff there is not useful. I don't know, having not used Blender for this sort of thing very much, whether there's a nice selective cut tool that I can use, but let's see what there is. Trims the mesh within the box as you move the brush. I don't know what that does. I don't really understand it. I'm sure I could I'll just see what I can do to get rid of this. Flatten, pinch might be nice. Okay, so this is my attempt getting towards it anyway. What I'm going to do now is go into object mode and I'm going to do a boolean to combine them. Just going to save first and select one of the models, go to modifiers. Boolean is a way of sort of combining or subtracting two models. Select the other one. Just going to think about it a little bit. And we want to union, which just means that it combines them together rather than removing one from the other. Okay. And I will apply. And that should have made the geometry, brought the geometry together. I will also just do a combine, selecting the two if I can. Let's see. Mesh. Object. Well, I could actually, okay, so it didn't remove this one. The model is now that one. So I've selected it. Let's go into Sculptor mode, and I will once again do a remesh. Okay, and now we can sort of, actually I'm going to do a remesh at a slightly higher resolution. Remesh, bam. Okay. Smooth the interface a little bit. And, you know, we could use, if we were aware that there was like kind of a nice bumpy texture to this, we could use the draw with an alpha mask to reinsert the bumpy texture after we'd smooth things out. So sometimes you can keep things and details in the sculpting section, and sometimes you might be mainly sculpting stuff to introduce detail based on what's already there. For example, this stuff that we've smoothed, it's kind of very obviously smooth geometry. Actually, we can do stuff in Substance Painter as well to make it look a little bit more kind of interesting at that point. Just going to use this flatten tool because the sides are flat and that stuff there is not flat. Dunk, dunk, dunk. It's a stalks that's probably got. That's a little bit too much. Cool. All right. Well, that's something like a reasonable looking high poly model. What we can do at this point is export it back out and try and do a reprojection and see what it looks like with that smooth surface in MeshLab. So let's select it, model, give it a good name, Maro Sculpt, export as an FBX, model, high poly sculpts. Where did I put that? Oh, it hasn't finished saving. $36 megs, okay. Yes. Okay, so there it is. That re-sculpted. It doesn't look terrible. We'll see what it looks like. There's a little bit of stuff there I didn't realize I hadn't cleaned up just then. But what we can do now is we can do a projection of all of the cameras to project their color onto the surface. It won't be perfect because some of it is kind of a different shape now, but I'll go through that process now just to get it. So we've got a kind of nice version of the sculpted object with a good basis for the texture. I want to use the texture I'm applying as diffuse map. At the moment there's no UVs on this object, so it will go through and kind of generate its own weird version of the UVs, and let's see how that goes. This parameterizing the texture atlas is the term that it uses for generating a UV map for the object. And I might just pause it while that's happening. Okay, so what does this look like? If we go to model textured, so that's good. You can see the texture detail there. I mean, what would have happened if we had a little bit more detail when we were doing our reconstruction? And it's possible maybe that there was this detail. Let's see, in the, just looking at that little bit there, it's a bit hard to tell whether that detail would have been captured here. Can't totally see it going down, but yeah, and those blemishes look kind of flat as well, these scratches. It's not difficult to imagine it taking a few more pictures and being able to get those sort of like scratches in the surface and everything that you can see in the texture here. You can see that that's sort of being gouged and blah blah blah, a little bit of a knock and stuff. But so, you know, we could have had that detail there to put into this nice sculpted high poly version. The bottom, of course, because it was projecting and there's nothing there, is all a bit of a mess. We'll have to clean that up later. But it's kind of taken bits that were very messy before and sort of projected on. You can see where it goes a little bit blurry, that the geometry doesn't really fully fit what it used to look like. So there's a bit of blurriness where it's trying to kind of merge images from different angles, and there's no kind of like point of focus in quite the same way as there is for these bits, where it's very close to where the geometry was before. But that's okay, we can work with that. All right, so now what we want to do, I'll save this, make sure we've got it saved. Going to duplicate this chunk, and all we want is the model, and I'm going to decimate this one because what we're doing now is retopologizing it. Show, is that how big it was? Yeah. We are still going to retopologize it, so well, let's try 40,000, see what that looks like. Yeah, that's fine. Just bring it down to slightly more manageable size, and I'll export that out because let's see. Let's export it as an OBJ, and I'll say why in a minute. So Marrow high poly decimated. Vertex normals means the direction that the faces is going. We might as well turn that on, doesn't matter. Cool, so as you saw in our little diagram before, talking through the different stages, we can do instant meshes. This is an organic shape, so we can give that a go. What I'll do is I'll do the instant meshes. I'll do the hand one, hopefully very quick. And then the process is exactly the same. We then UV map it. We can do this thing, material IDs, where we give different materials on the low poly that we can then, sorry, it's actually the other way around. We do the different materials on the high poly version, which bake in as particular colors for particular types of materials. So we might want to say this bit is going to be all wood, and then it makes things much easier in Substance Painter. But if we don't do that, those details are in the tutorials linked to at the end in the section for Substance Painter, just talking about some sort of more advanced things that you can do with Substance Painter. fills and masks and things like that is, I'm pretty sure, the bit that talks about that. What we're going to do now is instant meshes. There you go, the instant mesh. I'll just find it. Okay, here we go, and I will open the OBJ that I just exported. Great, it's got some weird artifacts there, but it's fine. Solve, cool, target vertex count. Let's see how that goes. Cool. Obviously, 1K is much smaller than the, what was it, 1.2 million? Yeah. So that would be quite. Well, that's a vertex count actually, so it's even smaller. Vertex count for that is going to be a little bit bigger than that. So that looks good. I mean, if we really want to finesse it, we could tweak it, but that looks fine. Solve, that looks excellent, amazing. Oop, there is a little bit of weird geometry there. Not entirely sure where that's coming from. Let's have a look at this as a wireframe. Oh, it's still got the inside of the other one in there. That's hilarious. What's hiding under the surface here? Oh, what happened was I accidentally exported the other one when I was doing that. So when I was doing the export, I wanted to File, FBX, export the high poly sculpt, but limit to selected objects. We have the correct model instead of the one where we'd accidentally exported the two objects. So this one we want to decimate. Actually, I'll delete this chunk. We would go through the process and reproject the texture onto this one, but I can't be bothered to wait for the moment. I'll still duplicate it, so if I wanted to, I could. But now I'm going to decimate this model. Mesh, decimate model, 40K, yes. Okay, there we go. Export this out. Yes, yes. Okey-doke. Let's open that up again. This time there shouldn't be that weirdness. Let's make it a bit smaller. 1K is fine. Solve, solve. There we go. A little bit nicer. None of that weird stuff that was going on before. Export. Pure quads. Extract. And save. Let's call it low poly instant mesh. Super funny program. Low poly instant meshes.obj. It's already selected, but I don't know why it needs us to tell it that. Okay. And I'll open a new program, a new general, I think. Actually, I'll keep it in this one. Just turn that stuff off. Save this. Turn off that one. Let's import our instant meshes version. So obj model. What folder did I save that in? There it is. Okay. Oh, it's there. Okay, now you'll see that it's actually, sometimes when you import OBJs to different bits of software, because it comes from a different sort of, historically it was exported from a particular program that used a different XY coordinate system. Often it will be rotated, which is what is the case at the moment. So what we're going to do is select it, and here in the X rotation we just hit 0, resets it back to its normal position. Cool. So there is our nice instant mesh, and I'm going to import our decimated model that it was based on. There we go. And again, let's select it, put it back where it should be. Cool. And if you remember from before, I'm just going to add a cube and do a really quick little go over retopologizing. So turn on the live thing. We want to snap to faces. We want to cull the back faces. What else do we want to do? It's all in the list, so I might just skip over some of the things that aren't totally essential for this process. I will set a new material. I'll make the material in the viewport a good color. In the materials, in the object settings, I'll go to viewport display and say in front, so it's never hidden. We can turn this on and off because sometimes it gets a little bit wildly confusing. Go to modifier, add shrink wrap, apply it to decimated shape, and we want to say show the cage, which just shows kind of like it as it is. Okie dokie. Okay, so I did just do this, but I'm going to do it again because it was a little bit too quick and dirty. What I'm going to do, so I had it here with the shrink wrap. I'm going to turn off the visibility of the shrink wrap for a second. I'm also going to turn off just the live snap because we are just going to rely on the shrink wrap really to get it to fit to the shape. Yeah, okay, cool. So we go into edit mode, just going to sort of resize it. Or actually I could do this in object mode to resize it and just rotate it to make it fit. Just so we can see what's going on in the material, I'm just going to set the viewport alpha, so the opacity, how transparent it is. Turn that up, and I'm just going to, with the object selected, have a bit of a tweak of the size and rotation of it to get it to kind of like fit into the envelope of the original shape. And that's good. Using, okay, I've just turned on the key press information again. Cool. So using G to sort of grab it and move it around. Want to rotate it as well. R to rotate it. And let's scale it out a little bit. Okay. Now what I'm going to do, so just go into edit mode. I could have done that in edit mode as well, just sort of moving the different parts around, but I'm not going to. And let's open that up again. Cool. So what I'm going to do is go into edge mode. I can hit 2 to go into edge mode. And I want to use Control R to add an edge loop, which is this set of edges that go all the way around. and you can sort of drag, once you've selected where it goes, you can drag it to reposition it. I am going to sit this in the middle. I'm going to do a few more. Oops, that there and that there. And I'm just going to have this process on. Just go back and make sure that it's in front so I can see the shape. And I can kind of guide the process of creating this geometry a little bit more than just decimating it. I can make sure that it's sort of fitting, because this is going to be potentially a bit messy, this bit here. Let's say there. And for this bit, I want to be careful that this geometry doesn't start getting weird. So I want to scale it. That's it snapping, isn't it? Let's see if we can get those points into a little bit of a better place. Just because what's going on? Okay, I might put another edge loop just there. Let's see how that goes. Tell you what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go back and start with this sort of position here. Going to add one more edge loop here at the end, and then I'm going to apply this shrink wrap. Oops, in object mode, apply it, and now go back in, add another shrink wrap, and then we can continue. Just to make sure that we've got a little bit more control over what's going on. Oops. Sorry, I wanted to add that modifier not to the decimated but to the cube. And now hopefully we can have a little bit more control. I've turned off the shrink wrap for the moment, or the visibility at least, just for getting this rough. It's still rough retopology, but I just want to be able to guide it a little bit. Oop. Just moving these around. I turned on the snap as well. Let's just get this end bit, which is kind of the messy, difficult bit. And now let's see what we can do with an edge loop, kind of in the middle. Actually, kind of just want to capture that point where it sort of starts coming in, and maybe a few. Okay. So adding those edge loops to the snap-on tends to make things a little bit more difficult because it kind of snaps the position, the stretch position. So I'll just turn that off. Add these. And what we could also do is, align these edge loops to the natural contours of the shape. So there's these like ridges and things like that. If we wanted to, we could come along and just say, okay, I want going back into 1 for the vertex mode. We could just sort of like line these up so they follow the shape. So they've got a bit of a better job at fitting the sort of subtleties of the shape. Let's say those ones as well. should have maybe had a look at that when I was setting up these edge loops. I'll put that there. I'll fit this one in. And you can sort of see it needs another edge loop there to nicely, turning off the snap, to nicely fit it. Maybe another one there. And cool. Definitely one there. Great, all right, I'm happy with that. Let's go out. And also remembering too, now that we've done all of this work, because actually the object still is like this. We've just got this live modifier on, so we want to, now that we're done, just go to apply the modifier, and now let's UV wrap this one. So we'll unwrap it so we have a good way of getting the texture onto this shape. So we'll go to the UV editing window, make sure that we have the cube selected. You can turn off the visibility on that one, and okay. What we want to do is just select seams on this, and we can do that in edit mode. We'll just go to edge editing. If we hold down Alt, when we click on something, it'll select a seam that goes as far as it goes, basically, before it gets interrupted. So we probably want to, we're just looking as if we're wrapping a Christmas present, where we would do the seams to get it to nicely unwrap. So I'm holding Shift and Alt here to add to a selection. I'm going to do there. We actually don't need those ones there. Control to turn them off. I'm not entirely sure how I can selectively turn off edges at this point. Shift to toggle them. Individual ones, it's all getting a little bit complicated. I'll just select these ones first because we want that end cap done. So Alt, holding down Shift. And we'll go to UV and mark seam, and you'll see it changes when we've done that. And let's see what we can do with this. Okay, now that we've got that cut, actually it's not trying to do the edge loop any further than that, so that's good. Just add these extra ones in. Again, holding down Alt to select all of the edge loop and Shift, and mark seams. And then we'll do a similar thing towards the end, the other end of it. Can see where they will join up. Alt, Shift. Mark the seams, okay. And now if we go to faces, hit A. Because we started from a cube, it's still got the UV mapping from what the cube was. But you know, this is totally wrong now that we've changed the shape totally. Which you can see because you can see where we've added edge loops and it's all sort of like super dense in some parts and not dense in others. So what we want to do, we hit A to select all of the faces, and we go to unwrap. And that's it, trying to figure out the best way to unwrap this onto here. And then if we just want to make sure that it's sort of fitted nicely onto here, we can select everything and say pack islands. It just tries to give a go of sort of moving it around to best use this space. We can also, you know, resize if there's something like a face. Generally, these should all be about the same size, but if there's an area of your object that has heaps of detail, you might make that bigger just to give more pixels over that bit. So we would scale it and then use G to move it around. But I'm happy with the way that it's chosen to do that. So let's now move on to the instant mesh and doing UV for that. As I say, Maya's tools are a little bit better than these ones, but these ones do the job for sure. Probably there's, at least as far as I'm aware, there might be some tutorial that shows things that I don't know how to do that are amazingly powerful, but I think in general Maya's UV tools are better. Here you'll see, you know, it's a little bit more messy, so this process might be a little bit more involved, or we could just sort of, you know, go fairly loose with it. I don't know if those are actually seams. You can reset everything, but you know, already the geometry is looking pretty weird. Is there an edge loop there? Kind of an edge loop. There's all sorts of ways that you can unwrap things. The different techniques of doing it, so just watch the tutorial for it, really. That seems okay. Right, I'm going to live with that. Faces, hit A to select it all. Let's unwrap. Okay, so you see, because this doesn't have continuous edge loops, we might want to come in here and do this process on this side. If I can figure out how to do it in this view. What I want is edges. Okay, so I can come in here, I suppose, and select edges here. And let's try that again. That UV, let's see. It's a shame it doesn't show up on this as a seam. I would expect it to, but there you go. Okay, so yeah, you can either cut the seams on here, or if it's easy, you can cut the seams on here. Although this geometry doesn't kind of really lend itself to easily marking seams. I can probably also just mark the seam and then grab this section. That's really funny. As I say, Maya is pretty good at doing this sort of thing. These tools don't necessarily seem quite as good. Now that I've cut that seam in there, I would expect to be able to just grab that bit and move it around as you would with G, rotate and all that sort of stuff. But let's pack the islands. Okay, cool. So both of these objects now have got UV maps. And let's go back to what we're doing. We are now at a UV mapped version of this model, and we can start doing stuff in Substance Painter. What I'll start off with doing, funnily enough, Substance Painter doesn't support baking the color information from the high poly to the low, which is kind of weird because it seems like a straightforward thing. But what we're going to do, excuse me, is export these, put them into Metashape once more, and then, okay, so low poly, and do a texture project so that we have that texture that fits to these UVs for the object. So FBX, export, selection only, just the mesh. Let's call this low poly and retopo. Bam. And let's call this poly instant mesh. Export that. Hopefully we've got the right ones. Again, I'm just going to duplicate because I don't want to lose anything. Okay. Import the model and topo. Okay, so what we want to do now that we've got it in is we just want to go through the process of reprojecting the images onto this model. So we'll just go to workflow and say build texture. These settings in general are okay. You can actually have, if you have heaps of detail, you can increase this to multiple images, 4K images. For this, that's not a problem at all. We want keep UV because this model's got UVs that we just unwrapped on it. And yep, diffuse map means like the color information. We can just say okay. And it should be much faster because it doesn't have to do that parameterization. Sorry. And it should be much faster. It's much faster because it doesn't have to do that sort of unwrapping, the automatic unwrapping of a very dense model. So it's just finished. Let's go to textured model. And that's all right. That's perfectly fine. You know, not too much distortion at the ends where we've kind of generated our own geometry anyway. So that looks pretty good. And of course at the bottom where there's no cameras that can see it, it's just going to sort of fudge it. You can see it's trying to sort of make up stuff in between, which is totally fine. So at this point, we don't need to export, because we've got this model existing already, the thing that we've just imported, we don't need to export the whole model again. All we need to do is export the texture that we've just generated. We can have a look at that texture if we go to, where is it? I think there's a view, mesh UVs, that's the one. Okay, so you can see what it's generated here. And we're going to export this out to use in something else. Can save from there? Yeah, maybe. But what we want to do is go to export texture and just export it as a JPEG. So I'm going to, I've already done this as a test before, I'm just going to call it low poly hand topo underscore texture. That is fine. Alpha channel means like transparency. We can turn that off actually because we don't need any transparency. And say go. All right. Okay, and now let's go into Substance Painter. So we could, of course, also do the instant mesh one. I think, let's see, one of them here is one I made earlier. There we go, that and that. So, sorry, this is the instant mesh one. Probably fits a little bit better to that bit at the end, but yeah, they're not too dissimilar. Okay, so in Substance Painter, it's just loaded up. I'm going to go to New. In File, I select the low poly that I want to get, which is low poly hand retopo. And document resolution is kind of how many pixels in the final materials that we're generating. This can be changed later, so it's not super important, but 2K is fine. And we just say okay. At this point, when you're bringing things into Substance Painter, you just need to make sure that you have your UVs set up so it knows what to do. And then what we do is come to texture settings, and we're going to bake the normals from the high resolution onto this low resolution. So we'll go to down here at the bottom, mesh maps, bake mesh maps. This output size, we'll do it higher in a minute, but we just will test it just because it takes a long time to do the higher resolution. We're just going to start with a lower resolution. So here where it says high definition meshes. This is basically baking from the high detail, high poly sculpt, that one that we sculpted and exported, and we're going to bake it onto the low poly. So let's hit go, and we're just doing it low resolution, as I say, so we can sort of sanity check it first. So what we can see here is that there's these little seams on the surface when it's done the baking. And I guess I'm kind of glad that we've got to this point to see that. Let's talk about normals. So I'm actually going to go back into Blender, and here's our object. I'll turn off the instant meshes. So our object is really sort of faceted. This is what it looks like normally. It's, you know, you can see it's got flat surfaces, which is trying to do the job of capturing the total shape. For some software, it will smooth this stuff out automatically. But the fact that those seams are there, I think probably indicates that we need to do a little bit more work. So I can show what a normal is by going into the display settings, just here, top right, and we can come down to normals and turn on this thing that will display a direction on all of the faces. It's basically which way the face is facing. So that makes sense for the faces themselves, but then there's also normals for individual vertices. There we go. And for edges as well. So if we turn them all on together, you'll see that at the edges here, this edge, the vertices for that outside edge of this face is pointing that direction, and this one is pointing that direction. So it's actually, you know, kind of indicating a hard edge at that point, but we can smooth it out. If we go in edit mode, and let's just select all of our faces and go to mesh and normals. Oops, mesh, normals. We should be able to say smooth vectors. Don't know if we have to do that more than once or if that just averages them out. You see it is changing it. I think there's normally a command that does it in one go, basically. Select face strength. How's that? Nope. In Maya, there's something called shading groups that can be basically get applied when you export the object, and you can sort of turn it on and off. Not sure if that's the same here. Might as well give it a go. Export FBX. Let's see if there's any smoothing options. Smoothing. Oh yeah. Well, I don't really know what that's doing at the moment, but I'm just going to go through and smooth these vectors until they stop showing up. So let's try it again. Okay. Now looking at the object, so remember we've got a few different ways that we can look at our object. If I turn off the display of those normals and just look at how it's represented, you can see that those edges are now, rather than being sort of like heavy faceted, I'm going to Control Z to go back to what it looked like before. Oh, is that still turned off? So that's what it looked like before. Let's see if I can redo. Smoothing it out just sort of takes the edges off that. It might take a while to get your head around what normals are. Direction information that's represented not just in the faces, but in the individual points and the edges as well. Can do all sorts of interesting things. So we want to actually export this one out. We might need to give a go at reprojecting the texture as well. Might create slightly different effects, although I doubt it, because I think Metashape's just doing stuff based on the geometry. But I'll do that, and we'll jump back into Substance Painter and see how that looks. Okay, so in Metashape it actually looks exactly the same one way or the other. I will still do the texture just to be on the safe side. So no obvious difference. I mean, I could export the texture under a slightly different name and compare them, but that's fine. I'll just do it again. Okay. And now, having done that texture bake process, you can see that those seams aren't visible anymore on this object. So if you have that problem, then it is probably something to do with the normals of your model. Cool. All right. So we've seen it works now. Just at low resolution. I'll go into the bake mesh maps again, and I'll do it. We might as well do it high because it's it just gives us a little bit more detail to play with. It will take a little bit of time, but we can live with that. And what it's doing, so it doesn't just bake the normal information. You'll see as it's going through the process and it updates on this little display here, there's information that's used to apply some of what's called the smart materials. So for example, it figures out how thick certain parts of the model are, the curvature in certain parts, and we can preview that in a minute. Normal map information we know. World space is just like basically where everything is. Material ID is if we wanted to put different materials in different places and make it easy to apply them in Substance Painter. You can see that information from the other tutorials that I posted. And here in the material information, this little pull down, we can go and have a look at particular ones. So let's say curvature just gives a little bit of information about how curved parts of the object are. Thickness should be straightforward. Ambient occlusion is, I think I might have talked about that before, sort of like faking the modeling of the light. Cool, so we can go back to material, and that information, as I say, is used for some of the cleverer ways of applying materials to an object. Okay, so we have our texture that we've generated and saved out in Metashape. Let's put that texture over this model first. So we can do that. You can just drag in our material, our texture file, into this little bit here, and it will pop up this window to import it. We can also just go through sort of file, import resources, but this is a quicker way of doing it. We want to set it as a texture because it's a texture. If we want to be able to find it easier, we could sort of put some tag or something that we can find for later on. And import resources, this is saying whether it's going to be in our version of Substance Painter for all time, or if it's just for this project or whatever. So we're going to say, okay, we want it. I haven't renamed the project, so this is the name of the project. I'm just going to say I want it in the project and say import. So if we save this and open it up again, it'll be there. And now we can go into heaps of detail. In this, there's information in the Substance Painter tutorials. So I'm not going to sort of dwell too much on things, but I'm going to drag this texture. Actually, sorry, first I need to make a fill layer. There, oh, that took a while. Turn off all of these channels apart from the color channel, and I'm going to drag that in there. Cool, and there's our photo projected texture on our object. We can see that it's got problems where the cameras couldn't see it. I think we can turn off the lighting, which might be helpful. Where would that be? Okay, so we can, rather than turning off the lighting in this view, we can just select base color, which displays it without any of the other sort of stuff getting in the way. So what we are actually going to do at this point is we'll go to create a paint layer, and we're going to clone some of this stuff from the top onto some of this, or actually it might even be better to do it here. we'll give it a go here first because this is the geometry. It's got the right shape. If this one bit is much bigger than another bit, or there's any distortion in the UVs, wouldn't be super helpful to do it in this view. But in this view, it would do everything sort of, making sense to the physics of the space. So I'll just drag that over there. And what we need to do for this, to properly use the clone tool to clone from a layer below, let's go and select, is that the clone? Clone, yep. I think we need to set this layer to pass through. Let's see. Oops. And to select the point where you're going from, I think this should work. Hold down V. V and left to set. Okay, so holding down V, I'm holding down the left mouse button and I'll just set it up there, I think. Oh, this is funny. Okay. And this is going to be a little bit like working in Photoshop too. Oops, did it the wrong way around. To reproduce, take bits from one place. Let's go there. Around our object. I mean, you can literally do this stuff in Photoshop if you want. That might actually work. Let's do it from there. Using the square brackets to change the size of the brush, like with the other tools we've been using. Let's see what I can do. Okay, so I just changed some of the settings on the brush to make things a little bit better. Like whatever. This is certainly opportunities for finessing things. If you want to, it's just like any other process. It can be a bit crafty, it can be a bit whatever. And of course, you can paint in much more straightforward ways. So we could just say, can I do a color picker? Base color, base color, color pick, that, and then go, work in a slightly different way. Or we could, there's a heap of different things that we could do to pull this out and make it work the way that we want it to. Also, you see, this would be potentially a nice bit to use the material ID, with this bit being a different sort of type of thing. We could have put that information in the colors, the material ID colors, and then just sort of dragged things in. And Substance Painter is really powerful with sort of smart materials and some of the things that you can do. Just for illustration, let's see, like some of the let's go for something that's dirty, because the way that it applies the dirt will be, there we go. So you see this one, I'll just go from base color to normal material so you can see the reflection on all the other stuff that comes along with this material. And then holding down, what is it? Okay, shift and right mouse button to sort of move the light around. We can see that this material has got areas of sort of reflectivity of dirt, all that sort of stuff, and it's applying this just using some of that information that we have from the baked stuff. And you know, I have some weird things that I've got, materials that I've tried to grab from different places. This is an alien skin material, and you see actually some things that we can look at just while we're using these funny materials is the way that it projects it. Substance Painter allows you to do something kind of clever. I might actually delete this one and just apply a kind of fairly straightforward material, say this tile. So I can drag this onto the object, and what it's going to do, you can kind of see from this that that's my UV mapping, and it's just applying it according to, you know, how I've set up my UVs here. So it's got that tiled pattern that's just applying over the top of my UVs. And because I've unwrapped my UVs, it's not terrible, but you will also see bits where you know, it goes a little bit funny at those intersections. One thing that we can do in Substance Painter is, instead of in the projection section, so if I select my layer, you can go to Tri-Planar, which just maps it in a little bit of a different way onto the object. That tends to, I mean, you can see the seams here a little bit, but you can also sort of get an idea if we scale this. Let's scale it. There we go. Up and down, you've got a little bit more control over how it blends the objects. Blends the texture onto this object in a way which isn't just using the UV map that we've already got. And this is especially handy when you've got kind of really interesting textures that you want to sort of map in a more natural way, where it's been difficult to get the seams of your, you know, you'll never get these seams to align up totally correctly, just because of the way that we do our UV unwrapping. So you might want to use that Tri-Planar sort of stuff. Okay, cool. So what we've got here now is we've painted that original sort of texture. We do have the normal map information. You can see all those bumps and stuff that are there, especially if we move our camera around. You can see the bumps that are part of the surface that have been projected from the high poly onto the low poly. If we wanted to, we could go in and sort of hand paint all of the details of like how reflective it should be. But also what we can do is just say, all right, well, it's a material that's kind of similar in texture to this marrow. And, you know, this might seem a little bit weird, but just for a sort of rough thing, I might go for, I might just pull in one of the types of leather, for example, just a sort of, let's go for that. Just not too shiny, not too reflective. Actually, maybe leather rough. Let's see what we've got. And we're not doing this really for the color information. Oop, that was something totally different. Let's see what we've got. So yeah, we're not really doing this for the color information. We're just doing this for the texture that we could also paint on. Say fabrics and I'm just thinking what a good sort of analogy to the leather might be. To the marrow might be. And I am thinking, let's try this one. Whoop, the texture is terrible. This one. All right, that sort of works. It might have a texture a little bit like that. We don't want the color information, so we can sort of come in and select the color channels on these parts of it and just turn them off. I don't know if we want that one as well. The folds. We can change the scaling of these things as well, just to make that sort of patterning a little bit closer to what we want. And this tool is super powerful. You can do all sorts of stuff. I don't know what caused that. Is that this? It's a funny little bit of something painted on the side of it. I don't entirely know what that is. But yeah, so you can see we've got that leather there, it's visible, but we just sort of turned off the color information. So we've now got the height information and the roughness. You can see it's kind of got that kind of skin sort of reflection thing and the interesting bumpiness to it. But Substance Painter is heaps powerful, and you can sort of do all sorts of stuff. You can make a new paint layer just to show what we're working with, and this sort of PBR, the physics-based rendering. We can come along and say, okay, I'm going to paint something. I don't want to paint the color. I want to paint the height, and I want to paint the roughness. And I don't need that pattern there. So let's try that again. Just the height and the roughness, and you say, okay, I want it to, I think that's going to make it pop out, yep. And the roughness, I want it to be really smooth, so the roughness really low. And then what you can see is, like, we can just introduce these bits, even without the roughness, actually. If I turn the roughness off, you can just sort of like paint things on to make it look like it's really wet, for example, on parts of the surface. And this physics-based rendering just gives you so much opportunity to do really interesting things with textures. Or you can just grab one of the interesting things here and say, you've got parts of your model that are made out of metal, parts that are made out of wood. You can just bang it on, have a bit of a play with how it's being applied, how the dirtiness of it is getting applied as well, that sort of stuff. And you just have heaps to do to produce interesting different effects on it. Again, here you can see sort of those seams from the original UV unwrapping that you can then go in and say, okay, I want them to be all tri-planar projected. Cool. All right, so finally we're going to put this into Unity. I'm going to end it here actually, because the tutorial videos that I've linked to give the full thing of how to go through in Substance Painter. I just thought I'd do stuff up until this point, and you can continue in the other tutorials to get a good feel of how you might work with your model. Yeah, it's not terrible. Got my light around the bottom and the, got a fairly consistent, if I go back to my base color, fairly consistent sort of coloring. It's not perfect, but there's heaps of time, opportunity to fix it up if you want to. There is a shape, and yeah, our material ready to go. And remember that this is the low poly, so having all that nice detail in the surface, being able to introduce these little effects and things just is really nice, given that this is a very small file that will run really nicely on a mobile device, for example. I don't even know if it's possible at this point to look at the wireframe, but it's basically that. It's a very, very simple shape that we are wrapping a texture around, and all of the information is coming from the texture that we're generating here. So that's really what we're going for. Cool. So one final thing that we should look at, these little weird artifacts that are showing up. If you're trying to troubleshoot something like that, so there's a little spot there as well. If we move the light around, you might see it, and that black spot there. If we just go through the different channels, so it's not the base color information, it's not height, because that's all one thing. You can also use, I think, M for material, maybe. There's some hotkeys for different things. But if we go to our normal, you'll see that those weird effects are showing up where there's a little gap in the normal map. We can see it there. Hitting F to show the whole thing as well. And what that is almost definitely, if we go back to our baking, I should have paid more attention to it when we were doing it, but just make sure that the distances are okay. So I might try, I don't know if this is in front of or behind, but I might just increase this and bake. Just most important one is the normal map. I'll just bake that and see what we get from there. Cool. All right, so that's it. Our distance was a little bit too small, I think. Ah, actually it's still there. That's funny. Let's try that again. Oh, I think that was my world normal. Which one's the one that is? Let's just do it for all of them, actually. Okay, for whatever reason, when it was doing just the normal, it didn't do the final sort of fixing it. But now that we've got the normal over everything, if we go back to material, those little bits have gone. And I just thought it was also at this point I'd point out the use of the render view, where we can hit this little camera there and go into the rendered setup. We can change what this background is. You see this is, and also actually in this view, the thing that's providing the light isn't just one single light, it's a environment. It's a HDR, so a 360 sort of sphere that's providing light from all different directions of different colors. So if we had a really metallic object, you'd be able to see the reflections on it. But it's not totally reflective, it's not really metallic, but still the different colors and the different intensities of light created by this background just make it look kind of a little bit more, or much more actually realistic. The way that the object appears with much more subtle lighting. And we can do things like set the ground, if I can find it. Where is it? The way? There we go. Oop. And just use this to sort of render out a nice view of our object. 1 to 2, I think that's still inside the ground. What our Mara would look like in an autumn forest, hovering slightly above the ground. Let me... There we go. On the road in an autumn forest. I think that's probably worthy of a screenshot.